So with that, I want to introduce Lisa Paulina, who's a member of the Atlantic Council's Board of Directors, a former vice chairman for the Royal Bank of Canada, and former global head of the Financial Institutions Group in the Corporate Bank at Bank of America. And Lisa is going to give us a scene setter before we hit many of the topics. So Lisa, I want to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm pleased to be here. And allow me to frame the conversation with a few definitions. A CBDC is a digital form of a fiat currency of a particular nation or region that's issued by and regulated by the overarching monetary authority of that country. In other words, it's backed by the government that issued it, and it's part of the base money supply. You know, Michael mentioned I'm the former vice chairman for the Royal Bank of Canada, and I should note that I am a US citizen, born and raised in Michigan, and speaking to you today from Chicago. For the United States, the CBDC would be a third form of the US dollar. So we have paper, we have coins, and with a CBDC, we'd have a digital dollar. And like paper banknotes, this would be a store of value. Our Constitution determines what Congress can and cannot do to create and weigh money, and the digital dollar would be in accordance with that legal definition. So what is it not? Well, a CBDC is not a payment, it's not a remittance, and it's not an online bank account. It's a unique digital bearer instrument that can be stored, transferred, and transmitted by all kinds of payment systems and services, just like physical coin and currency. It's also not a cryptocurrency. That is a digital or virtual currency that's created and issued by a person, a group, a corporation, or another third party, such as Bitcoin or Facebook's Libra. These are not issued by the state, and they lack the legal tender to be declared by the government. So by definition, they're not a fiat currency and would not be considered a CBDC. Both CBDCs and cryptocurrencies, though, can and will coexist in the future. So for the purposes of today's conversation, this is not an either-or discussion. You know, money has been around for multiple millennia, and it first made its presence known in the origins that we call bartering. It's mentioned over 2,000 times in the Bible, starting with the very first book of Exodus, and it's also mentioned in every book associated with every major world religion. We see evidence of bartering on prehistoric cave drawings, the earliest that we've ever found, and they're also in the pyramids in Egypt. So net, money has a long history of being important to humans as a means to fostering life, security, and well-being. So if we move from those prehistoric cave drawings right through to today, as you can see from the tracker, there's been this real basic surge of information requesting, piloting projects, everything that's been happening really since the internet came into being in the broadest sense in the late 1990s. And over the past 10 years, we've seen a huge growth really focused on two areas. One is wholesale and one is retail. Wholesale, as the name would imply, is business to business. And this is my world because it largely has focused on interbank transfers involving commercial banks, settling and clearing organizations, and those institutions that traditionally would have had access to central bank reserves. Retail, however, in the past 5 to 7 years, has really generated an enormous amount of interest and pilots, but it's far more complex from a policy perspective, as well as KYC and AML compliance, or Know Your Customer anti-money laundering. But you can see on the tracker that some of the countries that are piloting retail CBDCs right now include Sweden with its e-krona, the Bahamas with its sand dollar, 8 nations in the Eastern Caribbean going live this summer, the Ukraine, Uruguay, and Cambodia, and China, after 5 years, has just launched in April its first tokenized digital retail CBDC that they're piloting in 4 cities, as well as the area that's going to host the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. So why is this important for the United States? And that's pretty simple, because we are the owner, the proud owner of the US dollar, the world's premier reserve currency. And we have earned and owned that title since largely World War II. And I believe that's because of our economic stability, our rule of law, in short, our reliability. You know, on Sunday, Jay Powell said a lot of things on 60 Minutes, but one of the sentences that really underscores this is when he noted, "You never want to bet against the strength of the American economy." And people and investors in every nation around the world agree with him, and they voted with their wallets. So we're doing this call via Zoom, and because of the pandemic, this has caused a lot of people to look at much more closely what are some of the benefits of a CBDC, and why should we be undertaking these types of initiatives. First and foremost, we can retire any contaminated physical paper coin and currency with a digital dollar. We can also speed those types of government benefits from the government to the people. That's why it was included in the earliest drafts of the CARES Act. We can improve the accuracy and cross-border flow for the wholesale transactions I just mentioned. And we can also really work to improve the movement of remittances from those who have money to those who need it the most, the unbanked and the underbanked around the world. The die has really already been cast. You know, other nation states and non-state actors have taken up the digital currency mantle. And it's time for the United States to do so with urgency, with a cogent set of policies and with a resilient framework with an eye towards the future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. And it's a great scene setter. I want to jump right in. Obviously, recent developments from COVID-19 have spurred rapid adaptation from monetary institutions around the world. And I want to bring in Aditi first, who's the executive director of the Belfer Center for Science International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School, where she runs the Economic Diplomacy Initiative. And Aditi, first talk about from the frontier of digital currencies and stimulus payments and getting these payments to American households quicker. Do you think a central bank digital currency or a digital dollar would help in this regard, or are we behind the curve?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for having me and for this partnership on the digital currency tracker. We're very excited for that at the Belfer Center. In terms of the domestic argument for a digital dollar, this has really come to the fore because of COVID-19. You know, until recently, when I would talk about digital currency, one of the first responses I would get is, you know, why do I need it? My money is largely already digital. I move things around with a credit card and Venmo. And so how does a central bank digital currency change that reality for me? And I think what this pandemic has highlighted is that there are huge gaps in the domestic US payment system. We've seen issues with stimulus payments reaching Americans in a timely way. We've seen issues with Americans who are unbanked or underbanked, as Lisa mentioned, who have no way of accessing payments in real time. And so part of it is a financial inclusion argument where we have 7% of US households that are underbanked. Part of it is just a payments efficiency argument. It still takes 2 days for checks to clear here in the US. It still takes multiple days for deposits to appear in Americans' bank accounts, which is not an issue for many of us who are fortunate enough to have a good financial base. But for Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck, these delays and inefficiencies in the payment system can really add up to exorbitant fees. So I think there is the case to explore a digital dollar insofar as it promotes financial inclusion, and payments efficiency right here at home.
Right, well, that's great. I'm going to come back to you on the China angle and great power competition. But Shane, I want to turn to you. Shane, you're the co-founder and general counsel of MobileCoin, and which is developing privacy-preserving mobile payment technology and used to be a product counsel at Google. Let's go into the actual design. What would a central bank digital currency look like? And break this down for us. Do you think this would work? And can the Federal Reserve create something like this? And would it be helpful from a global competitiveness perspective?
Thank you, Michael. What we're really focusing on, and what I think a lot of commentators have been focusing on when building a CBDC for the United States, is that what we would like to have is all of the underlying functionality that we have with paper currency, but in a digital format, so that it would be something that would be, you'd have a tokenized or a digital version of your $20 bill, your $50 bill, your $100 bill, et cetera. So you would want to make it so that you can facilitate payments between people without having to go through the intermediary of a credit card processor or a payment network or something like that. You would obviously want to be able to have the same ease of use and ease of transferability that we have with US dollars. And so really, what we're focusing on is all the convenience and ease of use and low barriers to entry that we currently have with cash, just in a digital format. To me, that's kind of the core concept of what a real first-rate CBDC would be.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Gabriel, I want to turn to you next. You're widely recognized as the leading authority on digital currencies. You're the special technology advisor to the Honorable David Burt, Premier of Bermuda. It's a great title. And you've been advising best practices on these policies. So let's talk about China for a moment. And they've obviously enacted a digital yuan, and they're the first out the gate. From a global competitiveness perspective, given your perspective, where is the United States right now?
Well, I have three opinions on where the United States is with regards to China. A lot of people speculate and have been speculating that the United States has been left behind. But the reality of it is, one of the major points is you look at some of the stable coins that are most dominant in the market, or as dominant as things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and they're backed by the US dollar. Things like Tether and Gemini USD and Circle USD. So if you ask me who's winning the digital currency game from a fiat perspective, I would beg to argue that the United States is well ahead of most countries right now as the most dominant digital dollar. Furthering that argument, I would also say that when looking at CBDC, you have to really constitute and look at various factors, such as, are you trying to build a pure CBDC that represents M0 or M1 of the money supply chain, or are you trying to build a replacement for M2 in the case of systems like Tether, which are already sitting there? And then you have to start considering the risk of undermining the banking system when you create a more useful payment system or payment token system that also increases the velocity of a dollar. And what can that do to the inflation-based enterprise of the commercial or fractional-based banking system? But then the last point I would say is that if people truly felt like the United States was falling behind, I'm pretty sure that if it was to come down to it by force, the United States has several options of amazing companies that would be willing to work with it to accomplish the mission of a Federal Reserve-based CBDC. You have Gemini USD, Circle USD, Coinbase USD, and then Tether. So yeah. I think the United States is well ahead of the game right now.
Well, it's good to hear. George, I'm curious, I want to bring you in, George Bashvili, who's a serial entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and early crypto investor who has founded and backed numerous startups in this space and in the blockchain industry. And perhaps you have a different view because, following the latest announcement from Libra, which we know is what Facebook was embarking upon, it has clearly made strides in this regard. And it has faced resistance of not having good enough money laundering checks previously, but it just hired former U.S. Treasury Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, Stuart Levy, as its new CEO. So talk about the future of this narrative going forward.
Hi, Michael, and thank you everyone for being here and giving us opportunity to tell you about this digital currencies. So the banks have historically been enablers and backbone of the financial system. But with the several waves of technological innovations like semiconductors, computers, software, internet, crypto, and finally CBDC, which is coming in the nearest future, we see that a lot of the functions that bank was doing and also earning fees on have been disintegrated, right? So the intermediary necessity of having banks is slowly evaporating. And when introducing a CBDC, I think the government needs to make sure that the speed of this transaction allows the banks to adapt, because even during COVID-19, the system showed that the banks failed to transfer the stimulus payments as they should have, right? So this inability to adapt should not stay in the way of the development of next phase of financial system. That's when Facebook with Libra, and not only Facebook, but the whole conglomerate of the technology companies could hold hands with the US government rather than rival it, because at stake it's not the government versus the companies, but is the country versus the domination of other countries. So I think that there should be much more collaborative effort in this sense.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. And on that collaboration, Aditi, I want to bring you back in. And Lisa, I want your thoughts on this very briefly. From an international perspective, financial diplomacy is essential, and especially in great power competition, as we've discussed. And the United States begins to see its leadership role challenged by China. And the rollout, as we've discussed, of this digital yuan, the first of a kind, it's providing an uncomfortable flashback for the US, such as the competition for the race for the 5G. So talk to us about those competing theories and how multilaterally the United States could have done a better job, and what can they do now multilaterally? And Lisa, I want to bring you in on this afterwards.
Sure. So there are two things at play here, right? The first is that technology by itself is not going to make the yuan more attractive or the dollar less attractive. The primacy of the US dollar and the strength of the US dollar has been built up for decades since World War II, as the US took leadership of the global economic system. And so we've got two forces at play. One is that China does have a technological solution that could reduce costs, make payments more efficient. At the same time, you've got a US system that's in retreat. You've got a US policymaking apparatus that is not as invested in multilateralism. We're giving our allies a chance to say that they're looking for alternatives to the US system. I mean, Governor Mark Carney of the Bank of England suggested that that other nations should explore ways to reduce the dominance of the US dollar. I mean, this is unprecedented for the UK to say that other nations should look for an alternative. And so this is part of what we need to do, is participate in the technological conversations. And one way of doing that is to join the working group that's being led by Christine Lagarde at the European Central Bank, and to take a leading voice on some of these technological conversations. But the other thing is for us to re-engage with multilateralism and think about not unilaterally pulling out of the Iran deal, for example, which really hurt us with some of our European allies, and bringing nations along as we practice economic diplomacy.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I think the Lagarde Working Group is a really important to emphasize here today. I think, as we've discussed, even though the United States, the global reserve leader, it seems like the rest of the world is trying to go around the dollar at every turn. And perhaps, Lisa, turning to you, do you think that the Belt and Road Initiative, Chapter 2, is China creating enough economic incentives for countries in Europe to go towards their currency of choice and retreat from the dollar?
I don't know that that is enough of an impetus, enough of a carrot to have them abandon what has historically been a very strong, very unified relationship. Not to mention, if we're going to start to talk politics here, to talk about NATO and the role that NATO plays in all of this. So it's a bit like nine-dimensional chess. You can't say, I'm going to give you this bit of money and then have countries automatically swing towards another provider. I think it's interesting because Yves Mersch last week from the ECB, he has continually voiced a desire to develop a retail CBDC because he's actually more concerned about the cryptocurrencies than he is kind of the power struggle between some of the world currencies. But I would not dismiss the strength of the alliances that exist today on the world stage.
No, that's a good point. You know, Shane, I want to bring you in. Talk to us about what would be the necessary conditions regarding tech infrastructure for a country and its people before a digital dollar can be rolled out. Now, obviously, the United States, like we did with the Patriot Act or 9/11, responded. With COVID, we're responding now with a digital dollar. Is Silicon Valley, is the tech infrastructure ready compared to China as they're planning for their next big games?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I think it is. I think, especially in the last 5 years, Silicon Valley has, with some justification, been viewed as, not really wanting to engage with government, especially on big technology infrastructure projects. But I think in the last 5 years, especially looking at cloud computing, especially looking at some of the big government contracts involving cloud computing, you see companies like Microsoft and Amazon and Google really getting more interested in, providing these top level services and this, cutting edge technology that used to just be offered to private companies. They're really starting to engage with governments. And so that's great. I think in terms of some of the underlying primitives that you would need to roll out a CBDC, you would need, near universal adoption of basic technologies like cell phones, like high-speed wireless internet, things like that. And I think you've definitely got that in the United States. You have that covered in most of the world. Now, obviously, any sort of CBDC is going to be an enormous target for fraud, for scammers, for people trying to break the system. And I think that's an area where some of your Silicon Valley tech companies, which have been, targets of persistent private and public technological attacks for 2 decades in some cases now, could really provide a lot of help, both in design and all the necessary, extremely important detail work that you need to build a system that's safe and secure.
So, building on that, Gabriel, obviously Stuart Levy's announcement that he is now the CEO of Libra is very important for credibility, building on Shane's point. So talk to us about the significance of that, but also talk about what tech infrastructure would need in the US. I mean, are we prepared? Next month, if Jay Powell gives testimony and says we're ready to roll this out, what needs to be more to be done?
Well, I think Shane perfectly outlined the two core aspects of allowing a CBDC to survive in an ecosystem, and that's your internet availability or penetration rate, and your smartphone or smart device access. And generally speaking, most of the developed nations, such as the United States, have a very high penetration rate of both smartphone and internet-based access. Furthermore, there are technologies and deployments happening from the telecoms levels that are bringing next generational services like satellite-based internet for low latency-based transactions, such as a CBDC-based transaction. So if tomorrow the Federal Reserve decided to go down the road of issuing a CBDC, and it was fully sanctioned by everyone in the United States, including President Donald Trump, the United States would be more than fully prepared to adopt it. You already have advanced payment systems such as PayPal that operate in essence as a private form of a CBDC, if you will. While it is not a officially issued through a monetary expansion policy, it still nonetheless functions to the end user as such. And therefore, the United States, like most developed nations, are more than prepared. As a matter of fact, I would even argue that a very large percentage of the world, even undeveloped nations, are strategically positioned to benefit from a CBDC because of the high volume of internet and smartphone penetration rate.
That's great. And George, I want to bring you in on this. And I want to ask you the same question about the tech infrastructure for a country like the United States. Do you agree with Shane and Gabriel that there's enough tech infrastructure for a digital dollar to be rolled out at this time?
I think the question should be more like, do we need the full 100% internet and smartphone penetration to issue the CBDC, right? Because CBDC might still be accompanied by such things as credit cards, and there's other means which are already working today. So I definitely think that CBDCs are actually, in my opinion, overdue, and we should have got reason of such things as paper money maybe 5 years ago already. So the other problem is what it brings to the banking system in terms of their role.
Right. No, that's very important. Aditi, I want to bring you back in on your points you said about Christine Lagarde. Talk to us about the consequences of a digital euro being created without the U.S. being involved. What are the consequences of that, again, for the U.S. being left behind? What can we do? What can the private sector or industry do at this moment as well?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the US payment system doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? We need it to be interoperable with the payment systems of our trade partners so that we can participate in the global system. Right now, a lot of the global payments infrastructure is US dominated. We've got US correspondent banks, you've got SWIFT, you've got infrastructure institutions that, if not owned by the US, are at least available to US authorities so that we can implement our foreign policy goals, like implementing sanctions, like tracking illicit financial flows. And I think if we don't participate in the conversation of what a technological upheaval of that infrastructure could look like, then we risk having a system that is not in sync with that of our trading partners. And so I think it is in the US's best interest to engage in those multilateral conversations early and to lead those multilateral conversations. The ECB provides one avenue, but according to the Bank of International Settlements, you've got 80% of central banks exploring some form of digital currency. And so as these nations progress their own research and progress their efforts, I think the US has an interest in being a leading voice and a standard setter in this space.
Yeah, especially turning back to the tracker and the map as we began this conversation. Over 30 countries right now, we're monitoring this, and it's going to be important to see the evolution, because I really do see this as, if central banks are blessing digital currencies, it becomes much more legitimate. Lisa, turning back to you and putting on some of your former caps here, what do you think is the largest lasting impacts that we could see as a result of actual global implementation, not just of a digital dollar, but digital currencies backed by central banks?
I sent a note actually to Fred Kemp and Josh Lipsky, and I said it's impossible to overstate the impacts that would happen, because we don't have enough time on this call to talk about the waterfall second, third, and fourth order effects. But some of them have been touched on lightly by some of the other panelists, ranging from what is then the commercial bank's function, both with respect to the movement of currencies, but also separate and overarching and above in their communities. How do they work with a more centralized system, number one? And that would affect banks in every single country around the world, if indeed there were all of these different currencies. How do we monitor for security, for counterfeit, for hacks? How do we exchange information? And I can tell you that banks right now exchange information all the time, especially when we get multiple attacks, and there's a lot of very good people working on keeping the system secure. But thirdly, it has a potentiality, and Aditi alluded to this, of actually bringing people together as we explore how this will work, both in the earliest phases and then as we're working cross-border very seamlessly. And if you think about some of the tests, the Bank of Canada has a test going on right now with their CBDC, and they're actually testing it with the Singapore Monetary Authority and the Bank of England. You have the Bank of Thailand, started a project in 2019. They're doing tests with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. So people are understanding that they're not going to exist in a vacuum, but it's how do we protect what is the US dollar, have that coded with all of the laws and rules that pertain to our Constitution, and then still be able to operate on a global stage. This is what needs to be worked out.
No, it's very helpful. We've got around 7 minutes before we turn to a robust Q&A session. But Shane, I want to turn back to you on, as we're having this conversation, what are the important benchmarks or signs of progress that we should be looking for the growth of a successful digital currency?
Sure. Well, I think, just like with your, when you're looking at the adoption of a normal, government currency, I think you want to look for velocity. You want to look at, how quickly are individual units of a CBDC moving through the economy? How quickly do they change hands? You want to look at, what fraction of a particular, industry segment's payments, either in the retail space or in the commercial space, are being denominated using that currency. And you can use that as a proxy for adoption. Like one thing that I think that CBDCs will be very important for a sort of end user retail payments. And when you can get the average person who would normally use a credit card or cash and have them start wanting to use a CBDC, and when you start to see your average retail establishment start to accept CBDCs, that's when you really know that you've got something that people are finding useful and that is taking off.
And Gabriel, turning to you, what can the United States, if there is a group at the Fed right now with the U.S. Treasury studying what China is doing in their rollout, what should the United States be watching for? Because there are obviously very specific features of the currency that we've discussed, but what should they be watching for?
So let me touch on something really quickly. I think it's important to build up to the answer to that point. We at BIT have been working with central banks all over the world for the last 6 years, close to 40 central banks. And one of the main initiatives that we've been looking at is creating the Caribbean Settlements Network. And to the global scale, that doesn't matter, but in the context of this conversation, it does, because what the Caribbean Settlement Network represents is the ability for the Caribbean central banks, through a multilateral agreement, to settle to each other directly, circumventing the need to use hard currencies such as the United States dollar, the pound, and the renminbi, etc. Now, I say that because it's pretty important the United States start paying attention to these types of events, because in the context, when you look at organizations like the BIS, which is constituted of around 60 plus member nations, there's several nations around the world that are left out from that Basel process. And this technology allows them to all of a sudden be included in a formidable federation of an inter-central bank settlement. What the US needs to pay attention to is these exact types of conversations, such as the ones being had in the Caribbean, which are not China related, but rather an independent body of unified countries coming together to create their own settlement mechanism. And these conversations are happening around the world. And what the United States could expect to happen is a network of networks of inter-central bank settlements, from direct currency swaps to multilateral clearing facilities to trade-weighted index currencies that are not necessarily backed by the US dollar. So to Aditi's point, it's imperative that the US join these conversations. And as a matter of fact, we would welcome the United States to join our conversation in the Caribbean, of which the Bank of England and Canada do participate as observers in these conversations, along with several other central banks.
Yeah, so, I think, in building on that point, I think what the strength of the dollar has potentially created is a mindset of a basket of currencies worldwide. So your point about many settlements, I think, could very well ring true. As we know, there are many countries pegged to the dollar, many that use it as stability, but there may be a basket approach. George, I want to bring you in, and Aditi, I want to bring you in, and we have one more question before we turn to Q&A, and I want to remind everybody who's listening to please send in your questions through the Q&A tracker. We want to try to get to all of you. George, there's obviously a lot of concern around the terrorist financing and money laundering potential consequences. And as a former Treasury official, I'm very aware that this can help the unbanked, this can help speed up payments, but illicit actors are savvy, they're smart, and they're looking for ways to go around formal banking channels. I would love for you to comment on that very briefly, and then Aditi, I'd like you to do so as well.
So far, and up to this point, the biggest enabler to illicit trade has been the cash. Not the banking system, but the cash. And as the sooner we eliminate it and the sooner we make this transparent or semi-transparent systems, which will be able to track and go back into the transactions of where and which way the funds were flowing, it will basically leave the sort of illicit actors without means to exchange, or they would have to use by much different means, which are not as easy to use.
So George, just to push you a step further, so the impact on cashless economies, if economies become cashless, what does that mean? Is that good for an emerging market country?
I think it's good for everyone because it will eliminate or at least hold back the illicit trade. It will be a great way to fight the corruption, which is a big problem for emerging and also some developed countries. And it will give the power back to the people. So the states will have the power to go directly to people, not only in their own countries, but globally, but also globally.
Yeah. I want to turn to Aditi before we turn to Q&A. Talk about the, if you could unmute Aditi, what are the terrorist financing consequences here? Do you think if we have less cash in the system, there'll be less vulnerabilities, or are you still concerned?
I think the point is that as nations move towards developing their own digital currency mechanisms, we're going to have a more fragmented payment system unless we engage in those conversations early. So for me, the point is we're moving towards a system where things are happening digitally in different ecosystems, and we need the multilateral data sharing agreements to go after the terrorist financing and the illicit financing. Otherwise, we won't be able to rely on the infrastructure as it exists today to have that view. Obviously there are many benefits of having a digital currency. The flip side of that is we also need to think through what our privacy policies are going to be. And especially if we're moving towards that, in the US, how the Federal Reserve is going to handle privacy concerns around financial transactions while weighing the benefits of having a view on illicit activity. So I think we need to approach both in tandem.
Lisa, I just want to bring you in for a second on this point. Is this going to create less fraud, less vulnerabilities, or are we entering just a different digital era where there are still going to be many questions and the vulnerabilities are still going to exist?
I think the vulnerabilities will exist, but they will be of a different type. I do agree with George that cold hard cash is often what everybody is looking for. But the ways that people who are doing illicit activity look to exploit a system are ever more creative. I think it's also important, it actually loops in a bit of what Aditi just said a moment ago, which is it's a bit about privacy. Not every country's rules are the same. And right now we have a balance of privacy. Anything over $10,000 that gets recorded by your bank if you were to go in and move that money. If that money gets sent to Europe, there is something within FATF called the travel rule, which requires multiple reporting as the money moves around the continent. So how do we do that in concert with the US Constitution, then creates little air holes where those who are engaged in illicit activity will try and penetrate and exploit those. So this all has to be done, as I said, with a cogent set of policies, but being part of the broader global community as well.
Got it. Okay, I want to turn to some Q&A, and Shane, I want to turn to you regarding a question we have regarding how will a central bank digital currency disrupt traditional banking institutions? Do you see Jamie Dimon originally was against it, then he was for it? How do you see CEOs of major banks create a partnership with this going forward?
Sure. Well, in my sort of idealized version of the future, these sorts of digital assets, these wouldn't be something that would disrupt traditional banking. These would be something that sit alongside traditional banking. You can see there's been lots of interesting inroads into kind of traditional banking functions that new technology companies have been doing. If you're a small business and you use Square's Square Cash service, you can actually run your entire company through that. They have payroll processing, they have direct deposit, they have things like that. So I would like to see not disruption, but there being more options from the biggest banks down to the smallest sort of small business payment processing companies. So to provide a wider variety of services for companies of every size. So really, I would view a CBDC as being a complement to traditional banking.
Okay, and Gabriel, I want to bring you in for a good question that we've had regarding foreign direct retail access. So whether on permissioned or unpermissioned basis, if supported, a CBDC is a de facto global currency, which in its sense is in direct competition with domestic currencies of other countries. How do you see that competition playing out?
Well, at the moment, I actually see it as a collaborative effort between regulators. We are actually seeing regulators right now in discussions with how their CBDCs are relevant, or native CBDC can cross and talk to each other. I imagine in the future, it's going to be quite hard to enforce foreign digital assets from entering your shores. These could be private people's money like Bitcoin, private corporation money like Libra, or foreign central bank CBDCs. But at the end of the day, it's all about the design of a CBDC. Every central bank is completely unique. They have either they want a one-tier system, which allows them to directly bank the citizen, or they want to go through a two-tier system, which includes the commercial banks. They want permissionless. It all boils down to helping them understand what they need, watching that system go live, and then what type of relationships they have with those foreign regulators and or actors of those digital assets. Can you circumvent and stop them? In the digital cryptography world, it adds a level of elusiveness. But the golden part is in the digital asset space with immutable ledgers, you have a perfect digital record of every action.
No, and George, I want to bring you back in. Is it possible that a digital dollar is issued on the technological base or a framework of a privately issued cryptocurrency like a Libra? And I still want to push you further. Stuart Levy's appointment as head of Libra does change the game here. So answer with that slant.
So one of the models could be where the Federal Reserve allows certain banks or even private corporations or their groups to issue digital currencies backed by the US dollars, and they could be a legal tender, like whether it be Libra, JP Morgan coin, or Apple coin, right? Which will all be pegged to the US dollar. So it's still regarding the choice which Gabriel mentioned, whether they want the one-tier, two-tiered, or relaxed two-tiered sort of model.
Yeah, and Shane, just go back to you on what do we do for people who don't have access to the internet yet? Obviously, there's a lot of economies around the world who opt to be off the internet, off the grid. So Do they lose out? How does this work?
That's a really tough question. In a former lifetime, one of my jobs was to try to get free Wi-Fi access to as many people in the United States as possible, and we also worked on some projects in other countries as well. So I think it is extremely important that developed nations continue to make significant investments in both providing free infrastructure and working with the commercial providers of internet technology in developing nations to provide high quality, low cost infrastructure, because we don't want anyone to be left behind.
Yeah. Aditi, I want to bring you in because you just wrote a great piece for Harvard on the Fed during this time, especially in COVID. And there's been no discussion of foreign direct wholesale access. So it would effectively mean that foreign financial institutions could hold the liabilities of the Fed, which would eliminate the need for correspondence, but which is the equivalent of the Fed extending access to banks not subject to its oversight. So from an oversight perspective, do you think that's why the Fed is slow to jump into this digital currency game?
I think that's a good question. I think the Fed needs to evaluate the basic fundamental question of whether they're going to explore wholesale digital currency or retail digital currency. Many of the things that I talked about in my article and that are coming to the fore right now in the pandemic are benefits related to retail digital currency. So, the interbank payments network, at least in the US, already affords a level of low cost and efficiency that does not translate to retail users today. And so I think that is the first question is what is the basic design of this currency? And then we can begin asking questions about, access to banks outside US jurisdiction. But I think that interbank wholesale system is already much, much more evolved than the retail system. So for me, some of the real benefits of this would come in the form of a retail CBDC.
Shane, I want to put your legal professor hat back on. Let's talk about the role of the Fed here in response to what Aditi said. Do you agree, or is the Fed kind of trying to play a very slow game here and watch what others are doing around the world from a central bank perspective?
Well, I would both agree and think that the Fed should be taking a slow, cautious approach. The stability and the reliability of the US dollar is one of the most important things that the United States provides, both domestically and to the entire world. So, there are certainly some areas where I would encourage both, government and the Fed to work a little bit more quickly, but I understand their hesitancy. And this is an area where, I really hope that we can, do some more research, kind of in the spirit of public-private partnerships, to get some of the best practices around, technology development, security, privacy, things like that, out of the tech companies, which are quite good at them, and getting them into government projects.
So, Gabriel, I want to bring you back out to what extent do you see the development of a US-backed central bank digital currency being tested alongside existing banking operations, technology infrastructure, and other initiatives and clearinghouses?
I see that being a very high probability and likely something that's probably being tested right now. Like I mentioned, the initiative being done in the Caribbean, there is a lot of potential where the Federal Reserve of the United States, or a Fed coin, could very well support the issues that many economies face around the world, from de-risking to high remittance fees to financial inclusion. I think it's pretty important to note that while some can differentiate between wholesale and retail CBDC from an operational, a utility, a legal, and a regulatory framework, I think it's very important to note that from a technological network and frameworking perspective, the network and the transaction doesn't care about the activity it's going under. It actually just operates under all of those assignments. In other words, the technical solution used in, for example, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank could be used for both wholesale and retail-based CBDC. The functions are almost 100% the same. The only thing that changes is how they use it in terms of regulation. And I think that's very important, because to take away from that is to allow us to re-engineer how we see settlement happening both domestically and globally when we realize the asset classes are one and the same and they're programmable.
Got it. We have less than 7 minutes left, so we're going to try to keep answers brief. Aditi, I want to go back to the role of the Financial Action Task Force that Lisa pointed out earlier. They've done some work on digital currencies in the past few years. Given the great point you made about Lagarde's working group and our work with the EU multilateral on this issue, what role should FATF be playing?
Yeah, I think in general, we need convening bodies to set the standards for this conversation, to set the parameters for how we're going to design digital currencies and think about basic choices like this tension between having a more digitized payment system that gives us more visibility into transactions and therefore to track tax evaders and other illicit activity versus how we're going to protect privacy. And so I think there is room for lots of multilateral organizations to take a leading voice in this. But at the end of the day, I keep coming back to this point, and I really believe it strongly. This is one of those fundamental shifts in the global economy that is going to impact, it's going to impact many, many different countries. And so the more we can do to use our alliances, to use these mechanisms that exist to work together on this, the better off we'll be in the longer term.
And then just very briefly, Aditi, from a China perspective, what are you looking for right now for progress? I mean, what particular features and benchmarks are you looking at very briefly?
I think, first of all, it's the goal that they've stated, which is widespread domestic use in the next 2 years, and we'll see how that goes. I think next we'll have to see how that impacts international payments and commerce, whether they start investing in having the digital yuan, or at least the technology stack being exported to other countries, and how that impacts cross-border payments.
No, that's great. Lisa, I want to turn to you just to say a few closing remarks, and then we'll close it out.
Well, I would go back to what I concluded with earlier, which is essentially the die has already been cast. They being other nations, other countries, non-state actors, have really progressed this discussion and moved into the pilot phase. What I don't think we should do is ruminate all that much longer without joining in the conversation, understanding that the solution for America is going to be uniquely American, as well as with a design that can then operate with other countries as well.
So I want a quick up or down. We have a great question, and I know this is something that Josh Lipsky and I have talked about. Will we need a Bretton Woods type summit in the future regarding multinational data sharing agreements? Will the world need to come together like they did previously at Bretton Woods, but from a digital perspective? So I want to showing a thumbs up, thumbs down. Lisa?
I would say yes. And as we walked out of Bretton Woods, we worked together and according to our Constitution.
Shane?
Yes, for data sharing, I think that would be extremely valuable, and I would look forward to something like that happening.
George? Unmute, George.
There definitely should be a multilateral agreement between the countries with the ability for the new countries to join. So there should be a golden standard.
Aditi, unmute.
Yes, absolutely. The world looks very different than it did in 1944. Digital currencies is one aspect, but there are many other aspects that we need to discuss.
Gabriel?
Absolutely. The advent of blockchain technology allowed systems to be interconnected.
Well, I think we have, and I would agree. And I know the Atlantic Council, in conjunction with the Belfer Center, would love to be hosting that future Bretton Woods type of summit. I want to thank Josh Lipsky, the Global Business and Economics Center, the Geotech Center with David Bray and the whole team. I think the Atlantic Council, in conjunction with Belfer, is embarking on some very exciting work in this space. This is the first of many conversations that we will be having. So if we didn't address all of your questions today, please send them forward. I know we want to address those going forward, as this is just the beginning of the conversation. I want to thank our fantastic panel, Lisa, Shane, George, Aditi, and Gabriel. You all brought great perspectives to this issue. I know we will all be looking at the next stimulus debates, and we're looking at how a digital dollar will play a role. And I know we will all be publishing more content on this topic. So on behalf of the Atlantic Council, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.